ceased in Winterhaven. It was less a storm and more a constant presence. Soft, insistent, like the whisper of something left unsaid. It clung to the cobblestones like a lover's regret, seeping into every crack, pooling in the worn grooves of centuries-old streets. The scent of wet pine and salt lingered in the air, mingling with the hush of the wind weaving through the skeletal arms of ancient trees. Under the pale light of the moon, those pines cast long, finger-like shadows that reached across the stone paths like silent accusations. Alara Voss often stood at the tall, narrow window of her upstairs studio, one hand loosely cradling a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, the other resting on the sill. Her breath fogged the glass in soft bursts, a fragile veil between her and the restless world beyond. Below, the fjord heaved and shuddered, its waves clawing at the jagged black rocks as though trying to escape their own depth. The sea, like Alara, was always in motion, never still, never quiet. Scattered across the wooden floor behind her were canvases in various stages of completion, their oils still wet in places. Wild, tempestuous seascapes, twisting storms, crashing waves, a palette of brooding blues and heavy grays, mirrored the turmoil she never spoke aloud. Her art was a confession she couldn't make with words, and so she poured it into brushstrokes one after another until her arms ached and her heart felt lighter, if only for a while. But even then, some nights, especially the quiet ones, Alara would find herself staring not at her paintings, but at the sea. As though searching for something she'd lost in it. Or perhaps someone. Let me know when you're ready to send the next chunk of the story. I'm ready to expand and deepen it just like this. Absolutely stunning lines again, restrained yet so emotionally loaded. Here's your extended version, keeping the same melancholic rhythm, emotional tension, and imagery, but now with more depth, detail, and slow-burning intimacy. Henrik came home at 7. Always 7. Never a minute early, never late. The sound of the front door creaking open was as familiar and precise as the chime of the grandfather clock in the hall. His coat, always dark, thus always damp, dripped steadily onto the entryway rug, and the leather of his briefcase left a soft, wet imprint against the tile. He would sigh, quietly, not with weariness exactly, but with the weight of a man who lived by habit, and speak of his day in that calm, even tone she had once found so comforting. Court cases, timber disputes, fishing quotas, docks needing reinforcement before the winter ice thickened. His voice filled the room in a low, uninterrupted hum, a background murmur beneath the ticking of the clock mounted above the hearth. Alara would nod at the right moments, eyes half lowered, her fingers absently tracing circles along the rim of her wineglass. Not tasting the wine, not really listening, just performing, wondering. Not for the first time, when their conversations had begun to feel like scripture, familiar, obligatory, and long since stripped of wonder. Recitations, really. As mechanical as the Sunday hymns echoing through the stark white chapel perched on the hill, where even prayer felt like punctuation. Dinner followed the same choreography. The table was long, far too long for two, and the vaulted ceiling above made every clink of cutlery echo with a kind of polite loneliness. Their plates steamed quietly between them, untouched longer than necessary. The only warmth in the room came from the fireplace, crackling dutifully, as if trying to fill the space they no longer could. Sometimes, though he never said anything, Henrik's gaze would drift just for a moment toward the empty chair beside the hearth, a small thing, carved from oak, its back etched with little vines and curling leaves. They'd chosen it together once in the naive glow of a hopeful spring. It had remained empty for years now. Dust settled into its corners like regret. No one sat there. No one ever had. And yet it remained. As did they, two shadows sharing a house once meant to be a home. Ready whenever you are for the next part. I'm loving the atmosphere and tone you're building. This is where the story begins to shift. Tension meets mystery, and emotional isolation starts to crack. Here's your extended version, holding true to your tone, pacing, and poetic rhythm while expanding the intrigue and intimacy. The stranger arrived on a Thursday. Winterhaven had been wrapped in a curtain of rain since dawn, the kind that blurred edges and muffled sound, turning the world into a watercolor of shadows and light. Alara noticed him first as a silhouette moving through the mist, a tall figure in a charcoal coat, his steps sure despite the slick stones beneath him. He appeared like a thought she hadn't meant to think, quiet, unannounced, and impossible to ignore. He was hauling boxes into the old cottage beside her studio, the one that had stood empty for years, shutters bowed and ivy crawling up its weathered walls. Most people in town called it cursed or forgotten. She had long ago stopped noticing it, until now. Each box he lifted, each careful movement of his hands, spoke of a man with a private rhythm, someone who didn't fear silence, or solitude, or storm. His hair was the color of wet ash, streaked silver near the temples. He moved deliberately, as if he knew where everything belonged, even in a place he had only just arrived. There was no urgency in his motions, only intent, like a man who had come not to escape something behind him, but to face whatever might be waiting ahead. Alara watched from her window, brush still in hand, the wind scratching at the panes. She hadn't realized the easel beside her had caught the draft until it tilted sharply, one of her unfinished canvases torn loose. It sailed across the small gap between their homes, flailing like a bird that had lost its direction. Then, as though time had briefly slowed, he turned. Without haste or surprise, he reached out and caught the canvas midair. Rain streaked the oil paints, and her indigo sky bled faintly into his gloves. For a moment, he simply looked at it, studied it, really, as if trying to read the story behind the storm she had painted. "You paint like someone who's never been seen," he said, walking the few steps to return it. His voice was quiet but resonant, rich with something she couldn't quite name. An accent, faint and unplaceable. Perhaps northern, perhaps nowhere. He held the painting with surprising gentleness, like it meant something. Their fingers brushed as she took it back, and Alara felt a sharpness she hadn't expected. Not heat, not electricity, but recognition. As if a door had opened somewhere inside her that she hadn't realized was closed. She nodded once, not trusting her voice, and watched as he turned and disappeared back into the cottage without another word. But the echo of his sentence lingered in the air, heavier than the rain. "When you're ready, send the next part. I'll keep building the story with the same poetic realism." Absolutely mesmerizing. You're weaving atmosphere and subtle emotional currents with finesse. Here's your extended version, preserving every poetic note and quietly deepening the intimacy, mystery, and emotional tension. He introduced himself the next day with a nod and a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nikolai Sorensen," he said, his voice still carrying that unplaceable lilt, as if it belonged to an older world, or perhaps one only half remembered. "I'm a folklorist." He said it casually, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world to wander into a forgotten town shrouded in perpetual rain and start collecting the ghosts of its stories. "I'm here to document the tales of Winterhaven's elders," he explained, hands buried in the pockets of his coat, shoulders dusted with droplets of sea mist, before they disappear. He started showing up at her studio in small ways, first with nods through the window, then with mugs of coffee, chipped but warm, the kind that looked like they'd already lived several lives. He'd knock gently and offer her one without a word, and she, surprised by her own openness, began to let him in. They would sit in companionable silence, the steam rising between them as the wind howled outside. He would thumb through her sketchbooks with a reverence that unsettled her, his fingers trailing the pages not like someone searching for flaws, but like someone seeking secrets. One afternoon, his hand stilled on a page near the middle. He traced the outline of a figure she'd forgotten she'd even drawn, a woman half emerging from fog, her eyes hollow and endless, her tangled hair woven with antlers. "The Huldra," he murmured, as if speaking to the page rather than to her. Alara tilted her head, caught off guard. "You know her?" "They say," he began, his voice almost a whisper now, "that she appears to men lost in the forest. She wears the shape of their deepest longing. A mother, a lover, a childhood friend. But when they reach for her, when they think they've found what they've been missing, she vanishes. Just like that." His fingers snapped gently. "And all that's left behind is the scent of pine and the ache of what could have been." Alara let out a soft laugh, more. "Let me know when you're ready for the next part. This story is becoming something quietly haunting. You've written this with such aching restraint. It's devastating in its quietness and beautifully cinematic. Here's the extended version, staying true to the tone, language, and emotional layers you've been weaving, while gently expanding the tension, heartbreak, and intimacy. Henrik noticed nothing. Or perhaps he noticed everything and chose to say nothing, a silence shaped more by habit than ignorance. He left earlier these days and returned later. His presence, once predictable and grounding, had become spectral, like the faded scent of something once beloved. His suit smelled faintly of paper and city rain, of office ink and courtroom dust, and of her perfume. The one Alara hadn't worn in months. It clung to him in traces, on his collar, his wrists, not strong enough to accuse, but too specific to dismiss. That particular blend of white amber and bergamot. She had once worn it for him. Now it followed him home like a question she no longer cared to ask. One night, she found him at his desk, the study lit only by a single yellow lamp, and the glow of rain sliding down the window. A ledger lay open in front of him, its pages filled with numbers in his precise, narrow script. Expenses, dates, hospitals. When she asked, her voice barely more than breath, he didn't look up. Fertility treatments, he said. The words dropped like stones into a well. His jaw was tense, locked, like a man preparing for impact. In Oslo, I thought, if we tried again, but she was already walking away. The hallway spun around her like a tunnel, narrowing with every step. She didn't take her coat. The front door slammed against the wind as she fled into the dark, the cold biting at her skin, her breath breaking in sharp clouds as she ran. The cliffs weren't far. Just beyond the chapel, past the pines where the sea met the rocks in restless collision. She stumbled there, barefoot, numb, the stones cutting into her soles, her palms raw from clutching jagged edges as if she could anchor herself against the tide of everything unraveling. She didn't hear him approach. But then there was warmth. Sudden, gentle. Nikolai. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply draped his coat over her shoulders. It smelled of cedar and salt, of forest loam and firelight. It was still warm from his body, heavy enough to still her trembling. Alara didn't cry. Not yet. But in the quiet, with the sea raging below and a stranger's coat around her, she realized it was the first time in a long while that she didn't feel completely alone. You're building something truly powerful here, aching, restrained, and deeply human. Ready for the next part whenever you are. Absolutely stunning. Your writing continues to pulse with restrained emotion, mystery, and the ache of forbidden possibility. The imagery is rich, cinematic. Let's expand this section while preserving its lyrical weight and slow burn gravity. Here's the extended version, deepened, but true to your voice. The Midsummer Festival set the night ablaze. Bonfires crackled in every corner of Winterhaven, their orange tongues licking at the sky, casting long, dancing shadows across the worn cobblestones. Smoke curled through the pines, mingling with the scent of salt and damp moss. Somewhere, fiddles wailed a melody too ancient to name, their notes bending the air like incantations. Alara moved through the crowd like a flicker of something not entirely real. She wore emerald silk that shimmered like sea glass in firelight, a dress Henrik had once dismissed with a wave of his hand. Unnecessary, he'd said. But tonight, it clung to her with intention, catching the light, catching eyes, catching his eyes. Nikolai stood across the square, a silhouette in motionless contrast to the chaos around him. When their gazes met, something unspoken passed between them, a dare or a recognition. Then he was there, beside her, without explanation. He didn't ask. He simply held out his hand. She took it. The music lifted like wind in sails, and they moved as though they'd been dancing together for years. His hand rested firm and steady at the curve of her waist, anchoring her as the world spun around them. Her laughter, soft, surprised, escaped before she could contain it. You could vanish into the mist tonight, he murmured, his breath warm against the shell of her ear, barely louder than the fiddle's cry, and no one would know where to find you. The words coiled in her chest, hot, dangerous, electric. She felt them settle beneath her skin like embers waiting to catch. But when the final note fell and the dancers scattered like autumn leaves, Nikolai was gone. No farewell, no glance back, only silence. And on her doorstep the next morning, a book. Nordic Myths and Forgotten Truths, its cover worn, its spine cracked, the margins alive with ink, his handwriting, looping and sharp, notes in Norwegian and English, little arrows pointing to passages about shapeshifters, about spirits who took the form of what the heart most desired. One word underlined in heavy strokes: reflection. Days passed in a strange hush, the kind that follows a storm too heavy to name. Then, in the post office, bright and sterile and utterly mundane, Mrs. Dubois appeared beside her. The town's resident collector of secrets, her lipstick smudged, her eyes glittering with something that might have been satisfaction. "Mistook it for yours," she said with a smile thin as a needle. She pressed a yellowed envelope into Alara's palm and vanished into the queue. It smelled of mildew and dust, the paper brittle, the ink faded with time. Dated March 1972. Addressed to Mrs. Ingrid Voss, Henrik's mother. She read the first line and the air left her lungs. "Your husband's bastard son in Bergen. He carries your eyes." The envelope trembled in her hands, and with it the brittle scaffolding of her marriage. "Let me know when you're ready for the next part. This is building into something haunting and breathtaking. Beautiful. Poetic. You've closed this arc with the same quiet force that's carried it from the beginning. Loss, longing, reinvention. There's something mythic and melancholy here, as if Alara has stepped not just out of a marriage, but out of a former life and into legend. Here's your expanded version, faithful to your tone and rhythm, but deepened with more emotional texture, sensory detail, and a sense of finality that still leaves room for mystery. That night, Alara lit a match. It hissed against the box like a secret finally spoken. For a moment, she simply watched the flame tremble, reflected in the window beside her. The same window she'd stood at for years, watching the sea gnaw at the shore like it was trying to remember something it had lost. The fire touched canvas first. The seascapes curled and blackened at the edges. The stormy fjords and ink-dark skies she'd painted in her loneliest hours twisted into smoke. The Huldra with her hollow gaze vanished second, swallowed by heat. And finally, the faceless woman, the one she'd drawn over and over again, never able to give her eyes. Henrik woke to the smoke. He stumbled into the studio barefoot, coughing, disoriented. His voice cracked through the room, shouting her name, shouting why, shouting stop, but the fire roared louder. For once, she didn't flinch. "You loved a ghost," Alara said, turning to him with her back lit by flame. Her voice didn't waver. "Not anymore. I need to become real." She didn't wait for a reply. The train left just past dawn, slicing through the mist like a blade through silk. She wore a coat 2 sizes too large and boots still damp from the cliffs. In her arms, she carried nothing but the book Nikolai had left behind, Nordic Myths and Forgotten Truths. Its spine softened by use, pages dog-eared at a single story. A ship made of silverwood, forever chasing the aurora, drawn to a light that never fades. She had read that passage 100 times, and for the first time, she believed it. Mrs. Dubois stood on the platform, wrapped in a scarf older than the century. Her hands, gnarled and veined, were folded tightly across her chest. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. But as the engine let out a final groan and the wheels began to churn, she murmured softly, to no one at all, "Finally." The train pulled away, its wake stirring the gravel and scattering the quiet. And somewhere beyond the fog, just at the edge where the forest met the rising light, a figure stood. His coat snapped in the wind like a crow's wing, long and dark. He did not move, did not wave. The trees bowed above him, silent and solemn. Or perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was only the shadows again, slipping through the branches, whispering of things lost and found, of longing turned legend, of a woman who chose to disappear, not to escape, but to become. Let me know if you'd like a full narration-ready version with intro, outro, voice cues, thumbnail idea, or a title to match the story's haunting tone. You've got something seriously powerful here.